Hello survivors and welcome to Now That's What I Call Survival Horror, the first aid spray show where we talk about the various soundtracks of many great spooky games. My name is Sai and joining me on this episode I have Sherwin.
Here we are again.
Here we are again, right back where it started, with you and I and with Resident Evil 1, because I put you the list of games from Resident Evil that haven't been covered yet, and I think your reaction was, we haven't done Remake!
Yeah, I'm astonished we've never got around to doing it. But
I think everyone was politely being like, that's a Sherwin one.
Oh, aren't you guys the best? There we are.
And it turns out perfectly, because with the arrival of the Resident Evil board game soon enough...
subtle plugs are here again. Nicely done. Nicely done.
Yeah, thank you. So I imagine you've probably been listening to this soundtrack a lot anyway in the last couple of years as sort of good background noise for that, because that's what I would do. So I imagine you do it as well. So you must be even more familiar with this soundtrack than ever before, and you've curated a list of your favourite tracks from it, from 10 down to 1, with some honourable mentions, and ranked them in said order. If you've not seen an episode of this show before, that format should tell you that this is going to be a very subjective affair. We might not even agree, and you might not agree, so get down in the comments and let us know what are your favourite tracks, what are your least favourite tracks from this soundtrack. So without any further delay, Sherwin, I put it over to you to get the ball rolling.
The boil rolling. Okay.
I don't know what that was.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You just quickly before we hit the ground running too hard. You chuckle about that, about me listening to the soundtracks over and over. For the last 3 years running, I've been in, according to Spotify anyway, I've been the Capcom sound team's top 1% of listeners. So, I mean, that probably says it's just literally me listening to probably the Marshalling Yard on repeat.
The Marshalling Yard?
Just constantly going over. Just walking around rooms of my house.
I know you so well.
Yeah, it's like walking around. It's like walking around like my house, and it's just the site of a Resident Evil game. So for this is obviously been an extremely challenging list to pull together, and one of the things I try to avoid doing is on this, which helped a little bit, is to not look too much at tracks that are repeated from the original version of the game, unless they've qualitatively added to the experience. So, for example, if like two really good examples of my honourable mentions are Ivy's Domain and Vacant Flat, both of which are exceptional tracks, but we already talked about those in the original Resident Evil soundtrack show, and we know them to be tremendous, and also they're not really dramatic departures from what the original version was. They are both obviously exceptional things, and they've been updated with, I'm sure, better, like higher production quality and recording and so on. But because they're not doing anything significantly different, I thought I would leave them off. Because what I very much didn't want this list to descend into is I picked the same 10s I did last time round, and they're more or less the same thing.
Sure.
So we thought we'd have some fun.
Fair.
There are a couple that are going to push that a fraction, and we'll probably talk about those as we go through, I suspect. But yeah. So with that on that note, I think our first one we will go with is number 10 in this list, Rush of Fear. So Rush of Fear is a really interesting track to me. I really like what it does, but it's sort of this fascinating fusion. It's got this. It opens with this very, and I'm going to say Resident Evil Zero-esque sound to it, and it kind of returns to that place a few different times. It's not necessarily orchestrated sound. It's sound that you would create from just this sort of other collision of instruments or sounds or noises or whatever else. It's got this sort of visceral nature to it, which I really, really like. But then at the same time, there's also very quickly, and then a motif that kind of repeats itself a few times during the track is it's got this very, and again, there's another term I'm going to throw in there, which is this sort of new Resident Evil. It's not new Resident Evil. It's new as in it's Code Veronica-esque, I guess is the way of saying it, but sort of sound to it, which feels much more conventional Resident Evil that overlays over the top of that. So it's kind of a fusion of those two things mixed together, which is quite interesting to me. And I'm not sure it always quite works, but it does create this interesting and melody over what without it would be a very harrowing listen, which is quite interesting to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of like atmosphere to this, and you're right. If you like stripped out that melody, it would be a completely different track. I hadn't thought about that. Absolutely, this for me is. I feel like this is a bit of an underrated banger. Really, I don't feel people talking about this one, but when it kicked in, I was like, yes, I know what this is. This is. At least one of the themes that plays when you come back to the mansion. So it has a sort of storytelling heft to it, because at this point, you know everything is really messed up. You've been to the dormitories, you've seen giant mutant plants and sharks, you've experienced the Crimson Heads, you've read all the files of all these poor people that have lost their lives. Stars is doomed and you know it, and you just need to get out. And this music just says all of that to me powerfully. You know, you are in very grave danger of not getting out of this place. That sort of melody, which is really quite sad, which again it sort of feeds into that, played on some kind of woodwind, long drawn out notes, what you want out of a Resident Evil soundtrack. And yeah, the sort of clattering background sounds that you get through this era of Resident Evil as well, in particular something like a broken clock chime going on there and all kinds of nasty nonsense, is a really good way to start things off.
Cool. Well, so our next track we roll into is number 9, Underground. Underground is whereas Rush of Fear was very experimental, I felt, the fusion kind of nature to it. Underground really isn't. Underground is, I don't want to say your standard issue survival horror music. It's not. That really does is a detrimental sort of statement, but it's not. It's a very traditional kind of type of track for what this would be. But it's a really, really, really good example of it. Like, it's exceptional in terms of just what it does. Like, it's insanely atmospheric. It's really, really reminiscent of like old John Carpenter kind of Dawn of the Dead, even old Hammer horror kind of tracks in terms of some of how it works, which is kind of weird to say. But it's got a lot of old school horror vibe going on, which I really, really enjoy. And then the other sort of little tweaks here and there. It's got, you've got. You listen to it, and a lot of it is evocative of broken glass, of wind, of like whispered voices, even screeches happening, and there's kind of this sort of slithering that's so low in the mix that you almost miss it until you listen to it for a few times. But it's almost like you can almost hear yawns slithering somewhere in the background. It's really, really, really well put together, and as I said, it is quite a predictable track in that sense compared to a lot of the other stuff on here, but it is just so well done. I had to put it on the list. Yeah,
I mean, the first 3 notes I've got is dark, spooky, and unnerving. This actually, you're absolutely right, because this is more ambience than it is music for the most part. Really, it's like a bunch of hums and musical clanging sounds, and I didn't pick out the slithering sound. I'm going to have to listen back to it now to hear that, but that's really cool. I think the underground area in Remake and RE1 is probably my least favourite part of the game. That's probably a common opinion, really, but I'll be damned if it doesn't have some of the scariest vibes out of the whole lot. Like, it's a deeply harrowing place. Deep, hollow sounds that sound like they're reverberating around, cave walls that go on further than you can see or imagine. It's incredibly suitable. I don't have much more than that. It's just very effective at what it does.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the best way of summing it up.
Yeah.
Okay, so with that said, let's move on to number 8, which is Cold Water. So this is a really interesting track because originally when I first started putting this together, I kind of put it on, listened to it, and went, oh, okay, that's one of the tracks that's very, very close to the originals. I'll move on. Yeah, it goes on the same list as Ivy's Domain and Vacant Flat. And then for some reason, I'm not 100% sure, but I kind of finished doing my original list. This wasn't on it for obvious reasons. And I thought I'd go back. I was like, and it was actually, well, I know the reason. It was another track. It's a little bit later on, no spoilers, that made me kind of go, I will just double check to make sure I've not just picked up something that's the same as what I've already had. So I gave this one another listen as part of the trip and went, this really is actually quite different. It is, excuse me, you can tell it's extremely evocative of the first track, to the point where I genuinely thought that this was actually from the original game. Listening to it, it just sounded so much like what I remember from that original Resident Evil soundtrack. But if you are to actually listen back, go back and listen to them, like listen to one as an A/B check on this, it is actually very, very different. There is a motif that repeats itself that's quite similar, but the rest of it is just like a much more expanded vision of it. And what this does really, really well is it's so, and I'll use the word evocative again because it's a useful one here. It's so evocative of the location. Like it's so immediately, as soon as it starts, like bang, you're in there. Like you can hear the dripping water, you can hear kind of like the fizz of the consoles kind of breaking down. There's a whole bunch of reverb in there. There's something which this soundtrack does really, really well, and I think this is the first track that's massively jumped on it, or the other two. Is it does it's got like quite an oversaturated mix where there's almost like a hum at the top end, and it kind of has this sort of, as a result, it's almost like that sort of very big sound that goes into pop music to kind of push up all the levels and everything. This does it, and you can hear it in this track quite nicely. But it sounds, it really, really, really works in terms of what the location is, and for that reason alone, it's spectacular. But it also conveys this sort of sense of loneliness to it, this sense of almost slight wonder that you're exploring. It's not quite Tomb Raider, but you see where I'm coming from. It's kind of, it's definitely got that nice. Do you know what, the way of describing this? It does a really good job of combining the two traditional elements and the atmospheric elements that Rush of Fear doesn't quite get right. This does it perfectly.
Interesting. Yeah, you're so right in terms of like speaking to the location that it's from. It really could be nothing else, could it? Like it could be nowhere else in this game. And it's funny because Resident Evil 1 by its nature is a silly and unbelievable game, but also it's somehow very grounded. So everything about it's very grounded, especially compared to some of the later entries, and Remake in many ways even more so, just the way that it grounds the story, and it's all quite believable in its pseudoscience way. This is the area, I think, of the game where you almost start, it sort of slips. This is so weird, This is where Neptune lives, this bizarre aqua ring underneath the dormitory. It really makes you wonder, what the hell Umbrella are really up to. So this is the perfect music for that, because it's not only does it have that sort of air of discovering a mystery, but it's just so weird. It doesn't sound like anything else on the soundtrack, and in general, I don't really know what's going on here. Like that main melody, is that like a harp that's been put through a synthesizer? I don't know what it is. It feels somewhere between natural sounding and unnatural at once on the edges. There's the swirling massive sound that you want out of an area like this. They did a really good job of sort of reinventing this, and some of it's just really simple tricks, like slowing the main melody down. It's really obvious, but it works tremendously here, and then they've built out from that. It's really worth sort of checking them out back to back and comparing the differences. And whilst Remake doesn't reuse a lot of RE1's original soundtrack, sort of beat for beat, and this definitely isn't beat for beat, but it is sort of recognisably such. They've made a very obvious pick. Like this had to be something that they sort of referenced back, I felt like, because it ranked very highly when we talked about it before. So it absolutely deserves to be here. Cool.
So moving on, and they became a lot harder now to kind of do it. That's not to say the other ones are easy, but there's enough hints here that I could go to, okay, so this one kind of works but kind of doesn't. This one is great but it's much more traditional. This one is good but I almost thought it was one of the original was more influenced. From this point onwards it was more like any of these could go in any order. So apologies if you're massively angry at me for putting them in different places, listeners, the way you would, because trust me, these bounce around a lot. However, moving on to number 7, and this is definitely not one that appeared in the original. This is Room of Lisa. So, Room of Lisa is possibly one of the most sinister things on this soundtrack.
Yes.
It sounds so mournful, so tragic. And part of that, I think, is, to be fair, is not a slight confirmation bias, I guess, for me, because I remember the part of the game when this appears. If you were to listen to this in isolation, there possibly could be something slightly missing from it, in the sense that I wouldn't necessarily put the two together, or it could go somewhere else. But the fact is I do, and it does work really, really well. It's unsettling for that particular location when you first walk in there. It is... like, it almost dances around the same way as like the candle light does when you're in the locations where they're going, and it's got it down really, really well. Not only is it mournful and tragic, but there's also these like very evocative instrumentation that reminds you of screams or these kind of tortured howls that are playing throughout the entire thing. It's slightly more unorthodox, but it just generally it speaks nicely to this sort of idea of this is the voice, this is the sound, this is the space that is inside Lisa Trevor's head. Like, it's almost got this uncontrollable thing where you can't quite concentrate on what's going on. There's kind of this voice element or this scream element, this unsettling kind of thing that just doesn't let you ground yourself. And I think that's what this track does really well. And it kind of, it hits at past traumas, it kind of covers this unease now, it gives you this sense of constant barrage of noises and sound and screams and wails, and I think that's perfect for what this is.
So I think, somewhat side tangent, but I will get back to it, is that I think if you polled Resident Evil fans on the scariest thing in the series, your sort of top 3 at this point would probably be House Beneviento from Resident Evil Village for a more modern take. You go right back to RE1 and even Remake as well, because the way that it sort of plays with your expectation with the dogs jumping through the window. And Lisa Trevor is, I think, probably going to come out on top, the general agreement of the scariest thing in the series. And one of the reasons for that, as you've quite rightfully used the word that everyone goes to, very good reason, is just how tragic it is. Because, she's a child who gets horribly experimented on and yet still lives, and you have to, experience that head to head with her a little bit. And the music tells that story so perfectly, as you said. Like, I hadn't thought sinister is a great word though for sort of like that bed of music underneath, but the soft sort of female vocals morosely pleading for something over the top is just...
it's grim, isn't it? It's just
it is
horrific.
Horrible. I mean, this track has always made me uncomfortable, and I think it always will. And you're right, because of the context. Like, if you don't have the context, it's still a little spooky. But knowing what it serves is, it's so effective, and it will always be one of the most effective pieces in the series for me. I think everyone was probably waiting to see where this one landed. It's a hard one to rank because it's so horrible. But I love it.
So, moving on. Number 6 is Disappearance. So, disclaimer here. This one is a personal favourite of mine. I love this piece of music. I really do. It may have crept a touch higher. It may have pipped Lisa Trevor purely because I really like this one particular track. And exactly, funnily enough, as what you were saying, Si, if Room of Lisa is difficult to rank because it's uncomfortable listening, this by comparison is easier to rank because it's very comfortable listening, for me at least.
Yeah.
It's a very short loop. It's a very simply effective loop though. It's got this really interesting mysterious ghost story kind of vibe to it, which I really like. It's quite fun, and I guess it so perfectly fits the scene where it happens. It's so wonderfully. It just fits so absolutely brilliantly to that one moment. I can't actually imagine the scene, the main scene where kind of you first come out and Barry's Wesker and so on. I can't imagine how this fits in without how you do this scene without it. I can't because it just feels so characteristic of that. It's just such a solid way of setting the scene, and that could be a good thing. That could be a bad thing. Depending on your approach to it. But I think this is just so effortlessly brilliant at conveying the energy of what the game is at the time when you're there. Just perfect for me.
This is the one that's, I think, the closest to the original track, obviously, being Where's Wesker from the original game. But you're right. Again, as you just said, like it really couldn't be anything else in that place. And for me, the sort of the haunted house vibe and everything like that is just at the right level. It's just sort of unnerving without being in your face scary. Because nothing's really happened yet. It hasn't started. You don't want to start at 100. You need to start lower down and amp up. So this is a really good sort of introduction when you sort of get control of the player for the first time. Here are those sort of wailing female vocals again, which is interesting. And like how it felt like that was a part of Lisa Trevor's mind or whatever before. This feels like if these walls could talk in musical form, the pain that this place has caused. And headcanon, this is obviously not intended, but for me, it sort of connects Wesker, who's just disappeared, to Trevor because he had a hand in that. That's not intentional, but it does work. It's a really short loop, and it does play on my nostalgia absolutely. But you can't hear this and not think of the main hall and the storm outside and stuff, and vice versa. When you hear this, you don't even have to shut your eyes. Like you can just picture it. So it's picture perfect.
It's so interesting you say about the headcanon. So my first experience of playing Resident Evil Remake, I very much remember it, and being insanely excited to play it. And the reason why the wailing female vocal fits, because obviously around the back of the hall you've got the entrance down to the crypt, which is quite interesting. Because obviously just that came to mind then, but you putting me in mind of the first time I ever played Resident Evil Remake. Obviously, I don't know about you and everybody else's experiences, but mine was I'm going to explore everything in this place and see what's different, see what looks cool, and was delighted by how much extra detail existed behind the stairwell, rather than just looking a bit like it was kind of very much like the 90s version of the original one we had, and the steps going down and so on. There's really good camera angles and excellent there. But the thing that came to mind when I first went down there is you click on the thing to open the gate, and there's kind of like that sort of metal noise, and then you kind of have Lisa's wail coming up, right?
Yeah.
But obviously at this point I had no idea Lisa Trevor was even a thing, because I've not looked at any promotional material for this game. I don't know anything about Lisa Trevor. She wasn't in the original, and the first thing that came to my mind was like, Umbrella have just like trapped a whole bunch of zombies down there, and they're going to come up and get me at some point. That's cool.
Yeah.
And as soon as you just said, the horrors this place has seen, that's my mind. I'm like, wow, that would be like, it fits immediately to what we were just talking about. It took me back straight away to that original sort of moment of what could be down there. So yeah, a side note, bit of pointless trivia for people. Next one, number 5 is Death Trap. Death Trap is really unsettling. I mean, none of these are really easy listening, to be fair, but Death Trap is really unsettling, and I think, I mean, it's got, to start with, it's back to the 80s kind of zombie vibe, right? That's definitely in here a lot.
Yeah,
I hear a lot of Dawn of the Dead in this, which is cool. But it's got this really foreboding, like this sounds like you're creeping around somewhere, like you're cautiously exploring, that's somewhere where you don't necessarily want to be. There is this sense of this minor sense of claustrophobia there. It does feel, I mean, that's actually the name of one of the other tracks later on, but it feels narrow and close. It feels like, you are trapped in somewhere as you go around looking for places. It's got the slow build to the main theme and everything else, which is very simmering. And it's definitely got what I talked about before, with that kind of overproduced kind of loudness to it, which kind of fuzzes out at the top ends, which really adds to the feel of what this is. It's something where it's almost like you are waiting for something to jump out and attack you with this. It's the only way to describe it. It's like you just really have this sense of, I am not safe. Something is out there. I don't know where it is. I don't know what it is, but I am not safe, and I cannot let my guard down in any way, shape, or form. And there's so much going on with it. So there's, that's probably the best way of describing it. It's just got this sort of there's almost like this purity, I guess, to the main theme that almost gets corrupted by the location. It's kind of what I'm getting across. I've got no better way of describing that, but that's kind of trying to think of the best way to describe that feeling. It's almost like that. It's almost like the main theme is actually, to my mind anyway, when I listen to it, it actually feels quite pure. It's almost quite uplifting, but then it's just totally shot down by the rest of the instrumentation of the rest of the piece, if that makes any sense at all.
Yeah, the way that it sort of kind of trails off is like the rest of the music just sort of grabs it and snuffs it out.
And just drags it down, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. This is a weird one, because for the longest time, I didn't think that this was kind of a musical reference to the original soundtrack whatsoever. But this is essentially a new version of First Floor. I think it's First Floor Mansion.
Yeah.
But again, like the Aqua Ring theme, it's just super slowed down to the point where, for a long time, I didn't even piece it together. It just feels like it's so subtly put in there. And I love that kind of stuff where it's like hidden bits in music like this, and by comparison to some stuff, this is really obvious, and it should have been really obvious to me, but it's so different, and it uses it in such a different way, and it has such a different emotion to it, or such a stronger emotion to it, that didn't even occur to me. What you were saying about Dawn of the Dead and early zombie stuff, absolutely that. This feels like if someone needed a blueprint for horror music, if an alien comes down to Earth, etc., and asks what horror music is, this is an easy sell. It's so simple. It's really just 3 sets of strings just messing around with each other. And one of them's obviously out to get the other one, by the way that we just described it. But, it's great. Just great.
Which, funnily enough, is a nice segue to the number 4, which is Narrow and Close. Narrow and Close, I personally find absolutely brilliant because of a vision in my head of this. Is that the sell of this is, to me, is simply put, it's so in your head. It's like you've been hit over the head and have gone down, and you're coming back to consciousness, and you don't know what's around you. You've got this muggy head. Like, you can vaguely hear, I've got my eyes closed, I have no idea why. You can hear all of these kind of sounds drifting that could be footsteps, could be doors opening, closing, could be things being knocked over. Almost like, could it be a footstep, a voice? You've got all these sounds which are distorted and kind of floating through this fog to try and get to you. It's just not clear. And I mentioned claustrophobia before. This is the next level. This is all in your head. I've got no other way of describing it. Like, this is something very much present going on. Like, super, like Resident Evil Remake's soundtrack does a really good job of not generally being something that sits in the scene as like over the top of anything. All of the early Resident Evil soundtracks do that. They're integral to what the actual scene is. But this actually almost breaks the fourth wall and jumps into your skull. I've got no other way of describing this. It's something that Resident Evil 1's remake soundtrack does very well on a lot of occasions, and this is probably the best example of it. This is literally something where it's just tapped into your veins and it's going through you, and it's so in your head in terms of what you're doing. It's absolutely brilliant.
So this one's interesting because compared to obviously Narrow and Close is the name of a very different track from the original soundtrack, both playing in the sort of basement of the mansion. And originally, my notes start off with that I think I preferred the original, even though they are very hard to compare because they're vastly different. The other one is so angular and weird and in your face and aggressive. But the way you've described that, I don't know, it is a really tough call because they both do serve similar but totally different things because of the way that they're constructed. This is way more suitable for what Remake's soundtrack was going for, though. If they'd have gone for the hyper-aggressive sort of like weird synths of the original, it would have been very strange. But yeah, this is airy, haunted, ghostly tones. It's aggressive in its own way, but also sort of understated about it. Kind of like shouting versus the sound of teeth grinding, maybe. This one, again, is really ambient stuff, like Underground, probably even more so. And it's funny because not long after this in the series, we get soundtracks like Resident Evil 4 that are just that kind of soundscape. So this is almost like a precursor to all of that. It's this horrible subterranean thing. And I was clearly on one when I was writing these, writing little stories here with all of them. But it's funny that you say sort of about waking up dazed, because my sort of feeling on this was like, if there's a soundtrack to being buried alive, it could be this.
Yeah.
Which is very dark, but yeah, similar sort of like loss of consciousness and loss of faculties, absolutely.
Cool. So let us jump now from that then, in which case, funnily enough, since you said buried alive, to number 3, which is Concrete Bound. So this one, in my head, is probably the closest to the original that we're going to come. But it's so good. It's so good. Like, do you know, if you were to remake Resident Evil 1 now, and you were to make Resident Evil, in the same vein as how Resident Evil 2 and Resident Evil 3 and now Resident Evil 4 have been remade, at time of recording, this location would have no sound at all. It just wouldn't. It would have nothing. It might have maybe a low rumble somewhere in the background, something else like that, but it would rely very heavily on just how creepy, like having no sound, the absence of sound would be in this underground place, and you can hear anything out there, you kind of hear just very loudly because it's you and this other creature around the next corner coming to get you or wherever else. This is a really, really, really good example of how, in the face of that, a piece of music can elevate a location far, far beyond how effective that silence could be. This conveys so much in terms of, it's just, it gives you this cold, abandoned, not nihilistic kind of location. It just feels dead and foreboding and mournful, and like you can tell immediately something really bad has gone down in this place. You've got and what's nice about it is that kind of survival horror panpipe vibe it has going on. That could be really evocative of like the aircon. It could be evocative of the wind rushing down the stairs. It could be just this almost kind of mournful chorus of zombies, which is quite amusing as a concept. It also conveys, in the words of horror, it also conveys suspicion. It is something where you're mistrustful of it, of this location, because you know something has happened here. It's not, you don't feel like you're in a safe place at all. It's just got this really lovely atmospheric dirge is the way I'll choose to go with it. But it just fits. It just, like, especially for the top point of the game where you get to where this happens, you just look at it and you're like, I know where everything went down. I am at ground zero effectively. And this soundtrack is a big part of how that amplifies the location, quite a small area of the game, into feeling much, much bigger than it actually is.
You've set up all the points that I wanted to make. I love it. When you were talking about the sort of whatever that sound is, the panpipe or whatever, could be the aircon, could be the zombies. For me, this sounds like, blowing on glass bottles, which I guess is fitting because there's probably a bunch of test tubes down there, right, in this laboratory. But the melody that it is doing that is just sort of off. It's a bit out of control. And then you've got these large sort of rumbling breaths to it and everything. The whole thing is so weird. And we talked about this a little bit in Tear Death Experience. We did a music flavoured episode of that recently. And there's a lot of music that sounds kind of alien, but there are certain obvious tricks that you can pull with stuff to make it sound otherworldly or other universe, sort of, like theremins and really obvious stuff that's now we're all kind of numb to because we've heard it in so many pieces of media. This is alien in another weird way that you don't hear very often, and sort of when it comes to other games, be it the remakes or any other franchise that would be scoring for a moment like this, it's so surprising to me that they didn't go for really dark, imposing and brooding scary, which is kind of what the original does. Considering that it's the last area of the game, it is ground zero. This is more just weird science, which I really, really like. It's not weird science in the way that RE2 and sometimes some of the other games have sort of bleep and bloops. There's just something sad and lonely and drawn out about this that makes it just gel perfectly. I'm not surprised that this is so high up because I know you highly rated the original version. But yeah, I think it's very fitting that it ends up this high.
Cool. So now here's the bit where people probably get angry at me. Well, probably if not this one, then definitely the first one. So number 2, and this was hard, is Lost in Darkness. There's a lot going on with Lost in Darkness. There's so much going on. There's so much to unpack, and that is why it's such a brilliant, brilliant track. It's like a nod to obviously, again, it's a reimagining of the original, but it's so expanded. It's so very expanded. It's got so many nods to so many different parts of the original Resident Evil soundtrack, and so many nods to different events that happen in there. You've got like the sort of the crackle at the low end that could sound like a hunter. You've got a clicking that could sound like it's either the clock or it's the zombies, like the naked zombies in the lab sort of walking around. You've got the wind, you've got voices, you've got footsteps, and also the piece is relatively long in terms of its loop. It goes through a journey. It's got so much happening, and throughout all of it, if Narrow and Close obviously is you being knocked on the head and being inside your own head, and then and Death Trap is a more claustrophobic vision of this feels really open, but by comparison it's not really open. Oh, I'm safe. It's really open. I want to find somewhere to hide now because I feel exposed, and that's the difference. It's not like it's a different type of horror. It's not okay, I'm out in the open, I can see it coming to get me. It's like, no, I am not safe. I want somewhere to hide. Yeah, I am. Yeah. Bearing in mind, obviously, Resident Evil 3 sets up some tremendous tracks for this. It really does. If you were to, let's assume for a moment that Raccoon City, doesn't get nuked, and you manage to clear out a whole bunch of stuff, and you're just sort of walking around, marveling / horrified by the destruction that's happening. This is that sound. This is you walking around Raccoon City, just seeing the devastation and the horrors that have been wrought upon this place, and just feeling like, I am not safe out on these streets. I need to find somewhere to hide to get away from what is going to come and get me. And yeah, it's just got so much built into it. It's just got such a sumptuous, lovely nod to the main series and just to the original, and just pulls everything together in such a magnificent way that it's almost like I can imagine with this, they were like, right, this is one of the first things that anyone's going to hear when they play this game. Just really chuck everything at this and make it so that people go, okay, wow, this is really, really, really stepped up now. And
sometimes
no, I was going to say that's pretty much where I'm coming from. So shoot.
Sometimes when we do this show, I have an idea of what's sort of going to land up the end, because I know, generally speaking, what are the standout tracks or what's popular, or people might have mentioned something before. But with Remake in general, with its soundtrack, I've never really thought about what my favourites are particularly or anything like that. So I have to say, when I was going through the list, it was like, yeah, I actually sort of forgot about this one until it, as soon as it started playing, I was like, oh, it's this, yeah. Like immediately spine tingling. Those first few notes just get you right away. And it's so funny that you said like all these possible things that this music could represent. But for me, this is like the theme of the Crimson Head. Like, it comes to mind that long twisting corridor upstairs. I think it's west, second floor, where there's already one on the ground, already on the turn, that's probably going to get back up. And he just takes me back to that area. So in general, I think it is a really good theme that tells you that, you might think Resident Evil 1, but you're not safe. There's new music here, there's new rooms, there's new threats that you couldn't even possibly imagine. And maybe it's the game's motif that I never noticed, but we've got more sort of somber human vocal over the top of this as well, which I hadn't thought that that's Resident Evil Remake's soundscape, but looking at what we've picked out and talked about today, I guess it is. So yeah, it's what I love doing about the show, because I learned something about the soundtrack that I never picked out before. Yeah. This might define the entire soundtrack, this piece of music. Yeah,
that's kind of where I landed at. There's like a lament to it, isn't there?
It's very sad.
Yeah, it's like this is the at this point you listen to this show, this is the tragedy that is unfolding, and we are part of discovering what that is. It's tremendous foreboding for the rest of the game. Tremendous kind of preparation for you. Which leads us to the first track. Unless you want to add anything here, Si?
No, I think we're good.
Okay, so we roll into number one, and this is definitely going to make people angry because of what it is. Number one, for my choice, and there is a degree of me politicking here from a bunch of really, really, really very solid tracks, is end credits. Is it as good as Still Dawn? That's an entirely separate conversation. For me, the reason why I like this, I'm going to make an assumption that most of the listeners will be familiar with it. I think you are, Si. For me, end credits is like the end of Predator, where you kind of get to see all your old teammates once more, and they kind of do their salute, and it kind of adds this nice element to it. You finish the game, and all these guys who are dead, they're still with you. Like, they're like, it's like a last stand. It's almost got this, it's not obviously got the bugle element to it, but it's almost got that element of, this is us saluting the stars that fell in this place. This is like their last stand. You've got like this, the sepia thing going over the top, where you're sort of seeing scenes from the game, as like seeing the action scenes that have happened and so on. This is like the last salute to them, and it's got such magnificent storytelling in terms of the musicality and the ebb and the flow of what this is. It does such a good job of being of reminding you of how the game actually played through, not just with the visuals, but also very much the soundtrack in terms of what it is. It's very emotive. It jumps in. It gives you it's definitely a release, which is nice, and it really just builds this fantastic. Again, I've got no other way of saying it. This is like a very, very fond farewell to old friends who will not have made it out of the mansion, and it feels like a celebration of them. It feels like a last send off. It feels warm. It just feels very nice to me. I think there's something about this where I could genuinely listen to this quite a lot every day, because I think it just sounds really, really. It's just a really appropriate way to finish the game.
So, I don't know if I'm on record with this, but I can be now, I guess, since we are rolling. I think a lot of the ending themes in the series are kind of meh at best. Some of them are kind of they don't really land with me. Some of them I think are just outright bad. Like, there's a lot of really saccharine stuff when it comes to Resident Evil ending themes. And outside of that, some of them are very just sort of forgettable, but not this one. This is really, and it's funny that you said Predator, because this is really the Hollywood cinema ending that they probably wanted, but it still has very identifiably sort of Japanese roots as well. But all the emotional stuff that you just said there is exactly what I got from this. You know, there's that relief, almost a sense of pride that you did the right thing and that you were brave enough to get through the horror, but also, yeah, it's also kind of sad because it looks back on everything that's happened, all the lives wasted, and yeah, when it really kicks in halfway through, it picks back up again with a bit of pomp. And I've been doing a lot of like headcanoning, telling my own stories here, but you can picture the sort of remaining STARS members at a funeral in the coming weeks for bodies that they don't obviously have for all of their fallen comrades. Like that, it really screams that out at you. Yeah, it's fabulous in that way. It just really runs the full gambit of all the different emotions coming out of Resident Evil 1 and throughout the entire campaign up to that point. I'm actually, maybe I was surprised. I mean, I am and not surprised that this was sort of riffed on in Resident Evil 7's ending, because it's I guess technically it's not appropriate there because like you don't have the same story. But it's nice that they showed that it has a lasting legacy by referencing it. I don't think that it would have been my number one had I been given this list, but I can absolutely respect the reasoning why, and I think it's a really wonderful bumper for this whole episode, especially since like the last 7 we did were absolutely awful, horrific horror music. It's nice to end on a nice note.
I kind of thought that, in truth, the last 7 that we've done,
they're all number one.
They could all be number one.
Yeah.
The last 7 is literally almost like it goes 9. It literally goes 10, 9, 8. Okay, these 7. Ask me again in half hour, and I'll probably put them in a different order.
I'm sure. Yeah.
They're very, very, very close. And this was the only one where I said, do you know what? This is a nice finish to it. It's a nice send off. It feels very appropriate to say goodbye to Resident Evil in that way, and sort of close off the list as of the end of the game. So. And apologies to anybody who's waiting for the save theme. It is absolutely fantastic. It's also very close to the original.
Yeah, indeed.
So that's why it doesn't make it on here. Plus, I once went to a Capcom launch event for a game where it was played solid at me for 4 hours, and as a result, it's great. It's just in my skull in a very different way. so yeah.
Okay, cool. Excellent. Well, Sherwin, thank you for your list. Everyone, again, in the comments, get in there. Let us know how angry you are that the save theme isn't on here, but I think sound reasoning. And let us know any other tracks that you think should have featured, what your number one is, whether it was here or not. And don't forget, of course, to subscribe here on YouTube, but also you can check out episodes of this show a little bit later on our podcast feed, wherever you get our podcasts, but all new episodes come directly to YouTube, and even before that they come directly to our Patreons, where you can support First Aid Spray at patreon.com/FA Spray Pod for early access to all of our content. Sherwin, thank you for joining me.
Thank you for having us.
And thank you for watching / listening, and have a good week.